Hey everyone, how's it going? Thank you so much for coming this afternoon. Once again, I see some familiar faces and some new ones. We have Rhett Butler again this afternoon for a talk that's all new, so that's really exciting. We're going to hear about the state of the world's tropical forests. Before we begin, I want to thank our sponsors. So I want to thank the Brazil Center, the UT School of Journalism and Media, the UT Green Fund, the UT Biodiversity Center, and especially Fara Coffee, who's providing coffee today. So please feel free to get up during the talk and have some coffee. It'll be here until we end around 5. And when we end at 5, we're going to walk over to Crown and Anchor if anyone would like to do a happy hour and talk a little bit more about tropical forests. I really want to thank Fara. This is the 3rd event that Fara has sponsored for us. So it's really amazing to be working with them and have their coffee at our events. I wanted to work with Fara because Fara is not just a coffee company, but they're really unique because they have a very strong relationship with a particular community in Nicaragua. And in that community, they donate their proceeds back, or a portion of them back, to the community to work on community healthcare, to work on education. They have a Fara Foundation, which does this really amazing work there. And their coffee is also Rainforest Alliance certified. Coffee can be a driver of deforestation. It can cause problems for tropical ecosystems, but it can also be done in a way that's more ecologically sustainable. And I really wanted to work with them. Not only do they work with this community in Nicaragua so closely, but they roast their beans here in Austin. So they're local and they are sort of emblematic of that connection that we want to develop between Texas and the global tropics. So our speaker today is Rhett Butler, the founder and CEO of Mongabay. Rhett started this website that has grown into an environmental journalism powerhouse essentially on his own in 1999, writing all the content that made this website seem like it was a much bigger operation. And eventually, through ad revenue, they were able to hire some staff and continue growing. And a really transformational moment for Mongabay was when they incorporated as a nonprofit in 2012. Sort of helping to pioneer the model of nonprofit journalism and being able to tap into a new fundraising model, which actually allowed them to create their first overseas bureau in Indonesia and do reporting from really the front lines of the deforestation crisis, a country where rampant corruption and illegal activity was having a really negative impact on forests. And their reporting in Indonesia and now throughout the world has had some really tangible environmental benefits, helping to hold people accountable and sort of turn things around in certain situations where forests and other ecosystems were really threatened. So because of this work, Rhett has received the Parker Gentry Award for Conservation from the Field Museum of Chicago, which is in honor of very pioneering botanists and ornithologists who were tragically killed in a plane crash in Peru in the 1990s. Rhett is also the recipient this year of the Heinz Award for the environment. So Mongabay's work has been really influential in actually leading to real world outcomes. It's been very important to me also because I've been following Mongabay for many years, watching as their presence grew online. It's been really meaningful for my own journey to becoming an ecologist. And one of the things I think is so unique about Mongabay is that they don't just do environmental journalism, but they really report on biodiversity, which is not a niche that you see a lot in the media ecosystem. There are other people talking about climate, there are other people talking about oil drilling and environmental issues, but there are a few people who are going to publish those stories alongside stories about the latest species that have been discovered, or to do a roundup at the end of the year of the top 10 new species discoveries, or to do some really in-depth investigative journalism on one particular endangered species that few people have ever heard of. So I think it's really transformational for those of us who work in the biodiversity space. And I couldn't be more excited to have Rhett Butler come to UT today. So thank you so much, Rhett, and I will let you take it away.
Again, thank you for having me. It's been a great trip. So this talk, if you've heard me talk the past few days, this one is totally different. So nothing about Mongabay. So you can breathe a sigh of relief from that front, I guess. Okay, there we go. We're good. Great. So I'm going to talk about kind of the state of tropical forests. So it's probably obvious to most people here, but I think it is useful to provide high-level context just to get started. So we're going to talk a little bit about why tropical forests matter. So again, probably everyone's aware, more than half the world's terrestrial biodiversity is found within tropical forests. So what does that look like? So this is a list of arguably the 12 most biodiverse countries on Earth, and every single one of these countries has some tropical forest in it. I mean, arguably, that in the United States is pretty small, but it still counts. But so tropical forests correlate very highly with biodiversity in these countries. As you all probably know, forests also store a lot of carbon. So if you take the total sum of carbon storage across biomes, tropical and subtropical forests are at the top of the list. And so, in the same regard, when you chop down or degrade forests, it releases carbon. So if you were to look at emissions from tropical tree cover loss, and kind of sum them separately, they would be equivalent to the third largest source of emissions after China and the US. And if you look at what that means from the total emissions standpoint, so this is from the IPCC, so their estimate, the AFOLU, that's where deforestation and degradation and peatlands loss is embedded. But sum all together, it's almost a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions. Forests also have a really important role at a local level for climate. So they have a local cooling effect. And so when you have deforestation in the tropics, it will cause mean temperatures to rise. So this is actually one of the most important issues for people around oil palm plantations. So they're not necessarily concerned about biodiversity loss or other things like that, or carbon. Ambient air temperatures will increase 5 to 8 degrees C with deforestation. So if you're living in a place like Borneo, where you're kind of already at the sort of the high end of the thermal maximum, which you can work outside in, and you're increasing the temperature 5 to 8 degrees, it can be very hard to earn a livelihood. So you have to shift to working at night or things like that. And so that's a top complaint for local people, typically associated with forest conversion to oil palm plantations, just as an example. Forests are also really critical in the water cycle. So, hyperlocal forests act as a form of sponge. So if you have rainfall, they tend to reduce the runoff, and so they kind of will keep that water flowing over time, and then moderate the runoff. But at a higher level, so tropical forests have an atmospheric influence on precipitation patterns. So that's local, regional, and continental rainfall patterns. So I know this is very confusing, but what this is basically showing is tropics, Amazon, Congo, Southeast Asia. So this shows diminishment of rainfall in millimeters per month, and then this basically is showing deforestation. So there's a drop in rainfall as deforestation increases, and then the charts over here just show some of the projections in terms of, under certain scenarios, what deforestation would mean for average monthly rainfall. So the correlation is, as you diminish forest cover, you reduce rainfall, and that can have effects that are beyond just, say, like the Amazon. So something like 70% of South America's GDP is produced within areas that are fed by rainfall from the Amazon. And so if the Amazon were to tip towards an ecosystem where it's a lot drier, that would have an impact on a very large segment of South America's GDP. There are also models that suggest that deforestation in the Amazon and Central America can affect rainfall patterns in North America. And of course, there are millions of people, including indigenous and local communities, that directly depend on forests for their day-to-day survival. So their livelihoods, food, medicine, things of that nature. Of course, there are a lot of other benefits of tropical forests, everything from disease mitigation to stabilizing soil, to being a source of drugs and medicines that are derived from plants. So, quick overview of the world's tropical forests. So as of 2010, about half the world's tropical forests remained in either an intact state or a fragmented state. And then about a fifth of them were degraded, and then about 29% were deforested. So obviously the deforested and degraded area will have increased since then, and the intact will have then diminished a bit, but that's roughly where we're at. So when we're talking about the world's tropical forests, what are these? So one way of looking at these is sort of like these big chunks of forest. So the biggest one by far is the Amazon. So in 2020, that was about 526 million hectares, which I guess is about 5.3 million square kilometers, if I'm doing my math right. Congo was second, and then various parts of Indonesia and Southeast Asia would, be second, third, and fourth. The country with the most tropical forest is the Amazon, or is Brazil. So the Brazilian Amazon accounts for almost 2/3 of the Amazon rainforest. And then Democratic Republic of Congo would be number 2, and Indonesia would be number 3. And then the differences between the dark color and the light color. So the dark color represents primary forest, which is the most biodiverse, most carbon dense forest. And then the lighter green would just be the secondary forest. So some of the high level trends that we should be paying attention to for forests. So one is tropical forest loss remains persistently high. So despite all these conversations about saving tropical forests, it's been remarkably stable if we look at in terms of the rate of primary forest loss for the past 20 years. So there was an uptick in 2016 and 2017, which was the last major El Nino year. And now a lot of that was driven by large scale fires across Southeast Asia, but also in the Amazon and the surrounding ecosystems like the Cerrado. If we're talking about countries with the highest area of primary forest loss, so Brazil is by far the largest over the past decade, but as a percentage, they would be smaller than some of these other countries. So Indonesia has been number 2. Deforestation in Indonesia has actually been falling since 2015, 2016. A large part of that is because there hasn't been a strong El Nino. So I'm going to talk about this later. It's something to watch out for because this year is supposed to be an El Nino. Not clear how strong it's going to be, but if it is strong, we should expect to see a large increase in forest loss in Indonesia. And then DR Congo would be number 3. Bolivia is interesting here because its deforestation rate is really surging right now due to industrial agriculture. So another trend that's widely documented in the science is that the rainforest resilience is rapidly diminishing. So forests in a lot of parts of the world now, tropical forests in a lot of parts of the world, like the Amazon, are transitioning from a net sink, so sequestering carbon, to becoming a source of carbon. So actually resulting in carbon emissions, primarily from deforestation, but also fires, and then also forest die-off from climate change. So that has significant impacts. We're trying to think about the role that forests play in mitigating climate change. One of the most important things that's happened over the past 20 years is this improvement in forest monitoring. So we no longer have ignorance as an excuse for not taking action. Like, we know what's happening in forests. Every day it gets better and better in terms of what we can see. We can now see what's happening in forests even when it's cloudy and raining, using different types of sensors. So we have near real-time monitoring around the world. This is incredibly valuable for environmentalists, for journalists, for governments. The main problem is lack of will for actually addressing that deforestation. Not sure what happened to that slide. Recognition of the importance of tropical forests is growing. So this is partly because of the science. So we have a better and better understanding of the value forests offer to humans, which obviously is a very narrow viewpoint, but it tends to be how most decisions are made by political leaders and economic leaders. And so that's not just the carbon value of forest, it's things like water, biodiversity, option value, things like that. So there is, people are realizing that forests do have value as healthy and productive ecosystems. We're also seeing, and partly, as a result of that, we're seeing more and more high-level commitments. So those are commitments from governments, from philanthropy, but also from companies. I'll get into this a bit later, but a lot of companies are committing to eliminate deforestation from their supply chains. This really started to accelerate around 2010. The companies made these commitments, but the implementation's been hard, and most companies aren't really living up to their commitments. But it still is important to have a commitment on the table. So these are two sort of notable events. So one was the New York Declaration in 2014, where a bunch of companies and governments said that they would eliminate deforestation. I guess they would have deforestation by 2020 and eliminate it by 2030. And so the government signatories were representing about 61% of the world's, 39% of the world's tropical forest cover. And then in 2021 in Glasgow, the climate conference there, it was up to 85% of the world's forest cover represented by that, that voluntary declaration. So again, these are not legally binding, but they are entities that are making public commitments. So it is something that you can then hold against them if they are not abiding by those commitments. One of the biggest changes, I would say really in the past 5 years, has been the wider recognition of the contributions of indigenous and local communities in protecting forests, protecting biodiversity. So that may not be, that may not be the end goal of such communities, but it is a result of the way they live their lives and how they manage their resources. And so conservation has sort of had this reckoning where there's a realization that what indigenous local communities are doing has very effective outcomes when it comes to preserving forests. And so a lot of these big conservation groups are now starting to work more with indigenous communities, and communities are getting more of a voice at a table. It's still not it's still not representative of the voice they should have relative to the areas of land and the contributions they're making towards achieving conservation objectives, but there is a very dramatic shift in the conservation sector. And these are just a few recent studies that talk about, what this looks like. And so part of the reason that there's been this realization is that there's a lot more science and a lot more research that has looked specifically at indigenous lands and indigenous territories and what that means in terms of conservation outcomes. So just to highlight a few of these. So more than a third of the world's intact forests are within indigenous territories. These indigenous territories often have lower rates of deforestation, degradation, and fire than not only areas outside the protected, not only areas outside the indigenous territories, but often performing better than protected areas. So there's a very good reason for this. It's indigenous territories. Many of these communities have been on these lands for generations, and they have a vested interest in maintaining these areas as healthy and productive ecosystems. Whereas national parks, especially in the global south, like places like Brazil and Indonesia, are often very poorly funded and poorly staffed. And so you may just have a handful of park rangers to manage an area that's the size of a small US state. Another important thing that's really emerged over the past 10 to 15 years is the recognition that secure land tenure for indigenous local communities has very positive conservation outcomes as well. And so that's what these latter stories or latter papers are basically talking about. And sort of as a result of this growing recognition of the importance of forests and these commitments, there's been this big step up in commitments to also restore wild areas, including forests. So that is both replanting forests, doing like planting trees, but also having natural regeneration. So we'll get into a little bit later. A lot of these ideas are kind of half-baked or not really thought through because people aren't looking at the science and sort of the where trees should be growing or looking at things like land rights. But it is a very significant shift in the sector in terms of people thinking about restoring ecosystems as a way to help address climate change and biodiversity loss. So why are tropical forests being destroyed? Well, the primary reason is human demand for resources. So this just, sort of encapsulates the growth of demand for various raw materials over the past, 125 years. So we can see that it's rising. The same as for carbon emissions, they are rising. This is a proxy for resource use. One of the major trends, though, is that there is less deforestation from subsistence agriculture. So small farmers who are trying to put food on the table for themselves or selling to local markets. And more deforestation is industrial. So it's commodity production for export in urban markets. So I'm going to talk about this more later, but this is a very important shift. So what does that look like regionally? So in most of the world, or I guess if we're looking at the tropics, in most of the tropics, the majority of deforestation is being driven by commodity production and sort of large scale actors. The one exception for this is Africa. That is shifting, but still the vast majority of of deforestation is being driven by smallholders. So what are the major drivers of deforestation? So the single biggest direct driver of deforestation in the world is cattle ranching. So roughly 70% of deforestation in Brazilian Amazon is for cattle ranching. It's actually larger than that because there is clearing for like soy and other crops. And so the soy is actually used to feed cattle, which is kind of weird, but it is happening. Industrial plantations and farms is number 2. So this is like an oil palm plantation, but this would be, the big ones would be soy, oil palm. Oil palm is the crop that you use to produce palm oil. Wood pulp, so for making paper and cardboard. Timber, primarily acacia and eucalyptus, and rubber. So those are the big ones. I mean, coffee and cacao are also drivers, but they're much smaller. So logging is a big driver. So logging tends to not be a direct driver of deforestation. It drives degradation. And so what degradation does is a company will go in and they'll selectively log the forest. And they're supposed to wait, depending on the cycle, like 20, 30, 50 years to go in again. What tends to happen is then it's degraded and doesn't really have economic value. And so then they will apply a political pressure to have the land rezoned for conversion to, say, like an oil palm plantation. So this happens a lot in Asia. The other thing that the degradation does is it makes the forest more likely to burn or die off, and so more susceptible to, or less resilient. And then logging roads are a big driver of deforestation. So the idea is that a road is built to access a remote forest for logging, and then colonists will follow the road, or illegal miners, or or whatnot, and they will clear forest. So roads, I mean, same idea, logging roads, but it could be, a lot of roads are for extractive industries. So road will open up vast areas for clearance, typically by ranchers or colonists. And then illegality is a big and growing driver of deforestation. So during the pandemic, there was widespread collapse in governance across much of the Amazon and other parts of the world, but I mean, I've seen a lot in the Amazon. So that's the Brazilian Amazon, but also the Andean Amazon. And so essentially, authorities stopped doing law enforcement and just kind of pulled back resources from the frontier because they were dealing with other problems. And so there's this big rise in all sorts of illegal activities, from encroachment, land invasions, to mining, logging, so all sorts of things going on. And there's also quite a bit of kind of an intersection with narco trafficking. So I mean, this is very common now, where there will be narco traffickers who will then launder their proceeds through running cattle ranches or other forms of commerce. So some of the trends that are affecting tropical forests. So climate change is a big one. So higher temperatures are leading to forest die-off. Typically, there's also, that's associated with drought. And so when you have a drought, you'll have both a higher incidence of fire, but you'll also have forest die-off. And then in some areas, you're having coastal flooding. So you'll have inundation with seawater, especially when it's combined with something like plantation agriculture. So for example, like in Sumatra, in Sumatra, you'll drain the land, you'll drain some peatlands for doing oil palm plantation. And what that does is actually lowers the water level. And so then it's more, or that lowers the land because it's a peatland. And then that will lead to this incursion of salt water, which will lead to forest die-off. And so what does this mean? Like I mentioned, El Nino. So this is a satellite imagery with no clouds or anything. And so when the fires happen, which is typically, again, like an El Nino year, it can look like this. And so these are just a whole bunch of peat fires all across Sumatra and Kalimantan. So this is what we can look forward to probably in the next few months, if it is a strong El Nino this year. Forest degradation is another trend. So most of the focus is on deforestation, but in the Amazon, most years, the area of degradation is equivalent to the area that's deforested. And so this has long-term implications for the health of the forest, because areas that are degraded have a much higher likelihood of being deforested or dying off or being affected by fire. And so the emissions, so there have been some papers that have come out lately that have estimated those emissions from forest degradation, and they are quite significant, but they are often ignored by a lot of the climate models. And of course, forest loss is contributing to extinction. So we still don't really know what the extinction rate is, so we kind of guess, but estimates are, some of the most commonly seen estimates are 1,000 to 10,000 times the background rate. And this particular species is probably going to go extinct in the next 30 years. There's maybe only 30 left in the world. So the population has fallen by about half, or maybe 2/3 in the past decade. So this just shows, extinction of various groups. We know the most about, the biggest animals, so mammals and birds, but the little ones we really don't know much about. So I've already mentioned this, but there's been this fundamental shift where environmental degradation is increasingly industrialized. So you could call it, we're moving from poverty-driven deforestation to profit-driven deforestation. So this shift is really significant. And it's partly related to corporate consolidation. So companies are getting bigger and bigger and often more vertically integrated, especially in the agribusiness sector. And so what this means is that a smaller number of companies are touching a larger and larger share of global commodity production. So this specifically is looking at 15 key commodities in terms of forests and oceans. And so this is a study that's about 10 years old now, so it's probably even more dramatic. But back then, about these 100 companies represented about 25% of global demand for these 15 commodities and touched about 40 to 50% of production. So that's a very large share relative to the total number of producers and consumers in the world. So the reason this is important is it gives activists a much narrower target, and you could argue a more ethical target for their activism. So instead of going after 1 billion poor farmers who are just trying to feed their families, you can go after these companies, which through some relatively modest changes in the way that they source commodities can have dramatic impacts on forests and communities. So this shift really started in sort of the late 2000s and just accelerated. And it culminated in these zero deforestation commitments that I mentioned that really started to be signed. I mean, the first big one was Nestle, and then there's Unilever, and then it became a domino effect, really starting, well, it began with the soy industry in Brazil. It then went to the palm oil industry, then there was a cattle agreement, and it kind of spread across various sectors. That being said, these zero deforestation commitments have not been super effective because a lot of the companies made the commitments and then didn't really recognize how hard it was to actually implement these. But they have resulted in progress. It's not just greenwashing. And one of the things that's happened is because of the sort of the shortfalls, governments have started to get involved. So there's regulation. So I can't remember if it was last year or this year, but the EU passed, I think it was this year, passed a deforestation regulation, which covers a bunch of commodities. And so if you're sourcing commodities in your European company, you have to be able to show that it didn't result in deforestation. So it's a much stronger incentive than just a voluntary commitment. And so that's kind of where Europe is going. I don't know where the US is going to go, but California has proposed a few bills that are similar to the European regulations, but they haven't actually moved. They haven't, passed. So one reaction was for companies to sign zero deforestation commitments. Another reaction was to kill environmentalists. So this is happening, and this is only through 2020, but it's gotten worse. And so environmental defenders are being killed all over the world. The worst is really Latin America. So Colombia, Mexico, Brazil. Environmental defenders it's pretty widely defined, but it can be indigenous people, it can be activists, it can be journalists, but it is a real and growing issue around the world. Another thing that I've already mentioned is these efforts to value ecosystems. So, the most obvious one has been carbon. I'll talk about this a little bit later, but, carbon credits, carbon offsets. That is one way to try to recognize the economic value of the ecosystem service that a forest provides or another ecosystem. And what's been interesting is the science is getting to the point where carbon values are being associated with certain species. So if you have an ecosystem that is diverse with large animals, it tends to store more carbon than a forest that has been hunted out. And so you can start to say, this is the carbon value of an elephant. So obviously elephants have a lot more value than carbon, but it is another way to sort of add up values around animals, which is which is unfortunately, the main criteria for a lot of decision making in the world is around economics. So, one of the goals of this is to try to assign all the values that you can from a healthy and productive ecosystem to show that it's more valuable standing than it is being cut down. So that is the theory. I would say it's still very nascent, and there are issues with it. So these are some of the emerging trends with tropical forests. So, going off that last topic, there are a lot of controversies around offsetting. People are probably aware of these, but the whole idea of paying tropical countries to preserve their forests while industrializations continue to do carbon emissions is obviously very controversial and is arguably not really solving any problems. So that has been something that for the past 15 years has been very controversial. There are other aspects of this too. There are, carbon cowboys who will go into an indigenous territory and sign a contract that binds that the local people do not understand, that may deprive them of their traditional rights and their livelihoods that they've had from the forest. And then this company, the company pays, basically a few cents on the dollar, and then is reselling those carbon credits in the voluntary market for a significant amount of money. So again, a lot of controversies around carbon offsetting. This is also going to apply to biodiversity offsetting, which is new, but it is starting to happen. And same with water and other ecosystem services. I already mentioned El Nino. So El Nino, this is something that's really important to watch in the next few months, because if it's a bad El Nino, we're probably going to see a lot of fires in Indonesia and possibly in the Amazon. So, I hinted at this already, but sort of the rising authoritarianism around the world. This is a problem for people who are trying to protect the environment generally. Geopolitical tensions. So this manifests in all different ways, but one of the ways that it manifests is through demand for commodities. So food prices are going up because of the war in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That has knock-on effects throughout supply chains. So if people see the price of if the oil price goes up, then palm oil prices go up. Palm oil prices go up, historically, you would see a rise in forest clearing for palm oil. That hasn't really started happening yet, but traditionally that is what has happened. And when there was the last commodity spike in 2008, 2009, there was a increase in deforestation for a lot of tropical commodities. Another emerging issue is this boom in mining. So part of this is driven by the energy transition. So the metals that are needed to produce, say, like EVs and batteries, in a place like Indonesia. So Indonesia is trying to position itself as a major part of the EV supply chain. And it happens that Indonesia has a lot of nickel. And so there's a lot of strip mining of forests now in Indonesia for nickel production. And then because of laws recently passed, that nickel refining is happening in Indonesia, and it tends to be happening in coastal areas. And so you have a lot of pollution of marine ecosystems, through these processes. There's also, a lot of legacy mining. So whether it's for, energy extraction or other minerals. So this is happening as well. So, I've already talked about commodity prices, but sort of, inflation. So historically, there's been a correlation between inflation and deforestation in the Amazon. So when inflation is high, people in Brazil, they will invest in forest clearing, or they'll invest in land. And so you get land from forest clearing. as a hedge against inflation, just for example. Another thing to watch, which is really interesting, is these alliances in the global south. So, for example, President Lula of Brazil has been having meetings with the leaders of other large forest nations. So, for example, Indonesia and Democratic Republic of Congo, about almost forming like a tropical forest cartel or whatnot, as a way to try to extract more support for forest conservation. Because the argument is that, you know, we are making these sacrifices to protect our forests. Everyone benefits from it. The global north is primarily responsible for climate change, so it should cough up money to protect these forests. So it's not carbon offsets, it's different. So I think I'll end there to give us plenty of time for Q&A, but I can go into much more detail on basically anything. So thank you for listening.
Thank you for that, Rhett. I'll just let you take questions as they come up.
You mentioned that, or rather, I think China isn't in one of your main, like, I don't think there's an office in China, if I remember the graphs from the other presentations. Is there a specific reason? Is that a less good target given less tropical forests? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so Mongabay focuses in geographies where I feel like our journal is going to have an impact. And there is essentially no way for us to work within China, given the media restrictions. So our strategy around China, we do have a strategy for it. It depends on finding enough resources to do it right. And basically we just haven't gotten the resources. But if we did move forward with China because we got resources, we would focus on the diaspora. So we would probably have a base in Singapore, because Singapore is a very effective way to reach leadership in China. But it'd be focused on the impact of Chinese investment and Chinese, basically investment in activities in tropical, well, just around the world, essentially. So like BRI type stuff. I mean, the BRI is sort of evolving, but you know, that kind of thing. So that is our strategy with China. So I did invest quite a bit in China in terms of creating Chinese content in the late 2000s, but it was too early for that market. So it didn't really garner much attention at the time.
Focused in forests that are protected, decreasing biodiversity, or does it protect it all? And will it be more effective?
I mean, I think it just really depends on the context. Because if there is a forest that is very protected already, but it's highly vulnerable to climate change, or has like very rare species, or is very limited in extent, then you can argue that it should be a higher priority than an area that is unprotected. So I think I know it's not like a great answer, but it's like pretty nuanced, I think. It just depends on what the circumstances are. But I have met researchers who've sort of lamented that they were too focused on doing the science at the time, and that they weren't paying attention to what was happening, and then all their field sites were destroyed because of deforestation. So they lost, they focused on the wrong battle, basically. It's a very common complaint. So I have been attending the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation meetings for about 15 years now. And it's just been interesting to watch the evolution. It used to be like a big B and a little C. So like big biology, little conservation. And that's shifted to, and so what that means is like a lot of people talking about, like the ecology of ants, or, like species interaction or whatnot, rather than conservation. And now it's conservation is much more front and center. And so there used to be a lot of controversy within ATBC meetings about the resolution they would put out, because they'd often put out a resolution saying, Brazil, if they were in Brazil, they'd say Brazil needs to reduce deforestation, or Indonesia needs to do more conservation in Papua, or something like that. And that used to be very controversial. And now when you go to the meetings, they actually will, a much larger proportion of people are on board with sort of a conservation message. So I think there's a lot of evolution happening within sort of that community, which I think is representative of sort of like broader science.
And the other question I was curious about, are there any, is there any interesting pieces?
Sorry, what was? Sorry, I didn't quite hear the second question. Like, is there any interest in what? Yeah. Okay, so for your first question, yeah, I mean, I've had interaction with companies, and whenever we do a story about them, we reach out to them. We don't, I guess we hear back sometimes. We often will hear back after the story comes out and they're angry about the story. And we say, well, we tried to reach out to you and get your perspective, but you did not reply. Yeah, so I think a lot of sort of multinational companies, that are concerned about their brand or their image, are just trying to reduce risk. So that they don't really know the space very well, but they are interested in addressing issues if it's not too expensive or complicated. And so what they'll typically do, so sort of like the standard model is someone like a Greenpeace will do a campaign against them and say, we did an investigation and found that you are, destroying indigenous lands in the Amazon. And then the company will go, oh no, like, what do we do? And then they'll go to like a WWF or a Nature Conservancy, and then they'll work with a big NGO to try to clean things up and fix it. And then, so that's kind of like the stereotypical engagement. And so a lot of these companies are just trying to avoid controversy and be, responsible global citizens, to the degree that makes, I guess that makes sense. One issue though is that there's been this rise in sort of more opaque and less defined companies that don't care about the reputation. So they're just trying to produce as many commodities as cheaply as possible. And they're not selling to, they're like middlemen. And so they really don't care about any of this stuff. And they tend to be the ones that cause the most damage. They're also very hard to go after. Sometimes they're linked to a government. Sometimes they might be owned by a shell company. So there may be like a, responsible global player that has a shell company, and they basically have like a supplier or something that's actually still doing all the bad stuff, or the worst stuff. So that is a dynamic that we see play out. And then like in Indonesia, what happened is all these companies started signing these zero deforestation commitments. They were the companies that tended to be exporting, they sort of had international exposure, they were exporters. And so what the Indonesian government did is they created a biofuel standard. And so you had to blend a certain amount of palm oil based biofuel into the biodiesel. Like there was a mandate to do 15%, and they think it went to 30%. And what that did is it created a market for all the palm oil that didn't meet the zero deforestation commitments. So it's a great way to effectively create a price floor because there's guaranteed demand for palm oil. And Malaysia did the same thing. So, there are ways around these things. But that said, I think the trend is generally in a positive direction when it comes to big companies reducing their deforestation commitment. So for your second question on reforestation, yeah, I mean, there's tons of interest in reforestation. I mean, like Mark Benioff he's the founder or CEO of Salesforce. He has like the Trillion Tree Initiative. Like even Elon Musk was talking about planting trees a few years ago. I mean, Donald Trump was talking about planting trees. So it was like seen as an easy way to address climate change. The problem is that a lot of the discourse around planting trees was not really sophisticated. So it was like, let's plant eucalyptus trees on, like native grasslands or something, or, the things that just don't make sense, biologically, ecologically, from water standpoint. That said, like Mark Benioff saying when it eventually launched, it did have winter safeguards in place. And I think it's probably because people raise concerns about, we want to be sure this is done right. So respecting local people's rights, like using native species, planting trees where it's appropriate, like, in ecosystems that are forest ecosystems, not replacing grasslands with forests. So yeah, there's a lot of interest in it. There's also a lot of fraud in the space. So there are a lot of tree planting projects that are doing very little. And so partly to you know, to look into this issue, Mongabay actually launched a database to start to try to track some of the tree planting initiatives. So we're not, you know, passing judgment on them, saying they're good or bad. It's just purely about disclosure. So do they disclose the coordinates of where they're doing their activities? Do they do free prior and informed consent of the local communities? Do they use native species? Like, what are they disclosing? And so the project right now is pretty small. It's only, I think, about 400 sites, but you know, the ambition, we're really hoping to scale it up in the next year to over 1,000. And so the idea is that someone can go to the website and they say, I want to, you know, donate to plant trees. And they could then, and it will guide you through a series of questions like, you know, what part of the world is it, tropical or subtropical or not, you know, not tropical or temperate? Is it, you know, do you want to do something with local communities? Is it native species? So like walk you through a series of questions and then present to you a list of organizations. Or you can just say, I want to do this in Costa Rica, and it will present everyone in Costa Rica, but you'll be able to see, you know, this one doesn't disclose anything, whereas this one does. And so it's up to you to decide what you want to do, but it's the whole idea is trying to create more transparency. And one of the interesting things is when we started this initiative, all these companies start disclosing more information once they heard that we were doing this. So it already sort of accomplished, I mean, to a small degree, greater disclosure in the space and more accountability. That said, we have a long way to go, so we're really just like on, you know, step 3 out of 100. But you know, our goal would be to eventually have a much more comprehensive database.
We have a question from the chat. I think so. Norma, I saw you raise your hand. Do you want to unmute? I think we should be able to hear you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I wanted to ask you about the fires, because one of the things that I've run into, and I don't know if it's correct or not, is that the fires come in the dry years in the El Nino, but they represent clearing that's been going on for the preceding years. And so the clearing may be much less synced with the climate than the fires are. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I'm just asking.
Yeah, so it depends a bit on the geography. So in Indonesia, where this is, I guess, the most pronounced issue, essentially what happens is that a lot of the plantation companies will create conditions that eventually will lead to fire. So what they will do is they will drain the peatlands. And so what it does is that leaves a bunch of dried peat, which is extremely flammable and hard to extinguish once it starts to burn. It's also very carbon dense. And so once the fire season starts, then you end up with these big fires. So most of the area that's burning is not actually forest, it's just peat. So it's huge emission, but you're not actually losing on a forest. That said, those peat fires are really hard to control. And so they will burn into forest areas where they exist. And so if you look at like the Global Forest Watch data, the fires mostly happened in 2015, but the forest loss didn't register until 2016, just due to the nature, because they're using like an optical sensor, so it can't penetrate cloud cover. So that's what it looks like in Indonesia, Southeast Asia. So the Amazon, it's a little bit different. So in the Amazon, typically what will happen is like a land, someone who's clearing the land will cut down the trees. So the trees fall over and then they'll start, well, I mean, they're cut down and then you burn the land. But trees are relevant and then you burn it. And so in a dry season, those fires will then spread into the forest. And so it really depends on how intense the fire is. So, historically what would happen is you'd have a fire that would, if it was dry, would go and burn the leaf litter. So it wouldn't result in forest loss, but the forest would basically die. So that forest a lot of those trees would eventually die. It might take a few years, but it would also increase the likelihood that forest would burn again and at a higher intensity, and you would actually lose significant canopy cover. That said, because of the trends in the Amazon, some of these fires are getting more intense. So actually have, full on like a forest fire that we might see in in like Colorado or California, burning into parts of the Amazon, especially, the southern and the eastern Amazon.
Right. Okay. Thank you. All this is depressing, but it's extremely interesting. So thank you.
So about 10 years ago, I saw a few talks by Bill Lawrence regarding World Bank funding for infrastructure projects. And there was this conventional wisdom that funding infrastructure helps development in developing countries. But what he showed was that the types of projects they were funding were these large infrastructure projects, like punching a road into a roadless forested area, that ended up benefiting, you know, the 1%, if you will, you know, the guys running the companies that were planting the soybeans. And they're not really fostering social development. And so he was advocating at the time for a shift in policy towards funding the types of infrastructure projects that would help poor communities in developing countries and avoiding these kinds of projects that open up roadless areas. Do you know, I mean, I haven't really kept up with this in these things. Do you know if that has occurred? Is that
I can't tell you how much of a shift has happened. So, but part of the argument there was, I mean, absolutely true. Like a lot of these big infrastructure projects end up just being for, you know, mining companies or, you know, like plantation companies. That's like the primary client, let's say. Part of what Bill was arguing for is when you do if you're going to do like a large scale infrastructure project, being sure to do the right spatial planning ahead of time. So before you build that road, you create protected areas on either side of the road, and you have some sort of mechanism for protecting those protected areas rather than just having them be, you know, eviscerated. So I'm not sure the degree to which that campaign, or I don't know if you call it a campaign, but that effort was successful or changed policy. I just don't know. But that was, you know, that was the argument that was being made. I think like a complication to all this is that so China had this Belt and Road Initiative, which I think is around $500 million so far-ish. And so that was like a flood of money that came into the ecosystem, which is not governed by the World Bank. And that was in a lot of tropical countries. And so that was sort of, you know, I don't know if, yeah, I guess it came out of left field really, and just made things more complicated. So it was no longer a pitch to the World Bank, it was a pitch to the Chinese government, which doesn't necessarily want to listen to a Western scientist, you know, kind of thing.
so? This is a kind of related question.
Okay.
So, the conventional wisdom used to be that the settlers would move in, like on the frontier of the Amazon, and first they would plant soy, and when that was exhausted, they would do some kind of relatively unproductive cattle ranching. But the whole process required a constant progression into still forested areas. Has that borne out? I mean, has that left a less utilized area behind that might be a place where reforestation would be good?
Yeah, absolutely. So the order actually usually is you do cattle ranching first, and then you try to sell your cattle land to the soy farm, to the soy farm industry, because it's worth a lot more money. Like they'll pay a much higher value. Like I don't know the current rates, but you know, cattle pasture net present value in the Amazon is, you know, anywhere, I think it's like negative $50 to $200 a hectare. Whereas a soy farm, again, my numbers are probably way off, but I feel like it's like $800 to $4,000 a hectare or something. And so the process is usually you do cattle ranching, you try to improve or, you know, not degrade the soil or improve the soil so it can be done for soy, sell it to soy, and then you move on, clear it, you know, do cattle ranching, try to get some sort of, you know, title to the land. And then, because once you get title, then you can sell it to the soy farmers. So that's kind of, I think, the goal. So a lot of the cattle ranching is actually just a mechanism. It's really just land speculation. It's not actually about like producing viable cattle. It's about, you know, trying to sell the land for more money, because this forest is worth almost nothing in a lot of parts of the Amazon. But if you can get title to it, then you can sell it for a lot more than nothing. So that's like the main play there.
Is the soy sustainable enough that does it get exhausted to the point that does the frontier continue to move and leave behind an area that might have?
Oh yeah, sorry, I forgot that part of the question. Yeah, so one of the things, like there was a big breakthrough in Brazil was a type of soybean where you could, adulterate the soil with lime, and then you could actually do soy for longer periods of time. But yeah, so there is a lot. There's like 100 million hectares, give or take, of very low yielding degraded cattle pasture that is suitable for oil palm plantations in the Amazon. So theoretically, you could grow oil palm in the Amazon without deforestation and generate 5,000 times the employment per hectare. And you're talking about a net present value of $5,000 to $35,000 a hectare versus zero. So I always kind of wondered, like, why oil palm didn't take off more in the Amazon. So the way that, it's not a native species either, so you don't have the same issues you would with pests, like in like Africa. The way oil palm is developed in the Amazon has been, often through deforestation or dispossession of indigenous lands. I mean, of course, like with all this, with oil palm, you have issues with pollution, chemicals and pesticides. So I mean, that is an issue that would need to be addressed. But theoretically, an oil palm plantation, I think it averages like 35 or 60 tons of carbon per hectare over its lifespan. It also, it's kind of like a tree, so it has transpiration. I mean, more than like a thin cattle pasture. So I mean, I always thought that was something that seemed like it'd be economically viable, which I don't know why it didn't take off. I mean, I think it's labor costs, but yeah, there is a lot of opportunity for regeneration, and a lot of that can be just natural regeneration. If you still have fragments of forest and they're kind of viable, that forest can recover in lots of parts of the Amazon, and it is recovering. I can't remember the numbers, but there has been research showing how much of the Amazon is reforested, or recovered. So like the total, well, the area deforested since like 1978, I think is like 17 or 18% of the Amazon, but the amount of forest cover is actually higher than that because some of it has regrown. So that is positive, and you can also assist the process by putting up like bat boxes and bird boxes and things like that, provided there is some remnant forest left to assist that process.
We'd like to come back to the China issue. I think one of the trends, in terms of global markets, is the emergence of China as the consumer of commodities coming from crop. Of course, China is the largest consumer of soybeans from Brazil, Argentina, other countries. Poultry is poor. As income rises in China, likely it will be a market for beef. And it's, as you already mentioned, it's really hard to reach out to the Chinese government. They were signatory to the Glasgow Declaration. My question is, how do you think would be the strategy to make the Chinese movement more aware of this, respect to actually implement the zero deforestation declaration? Do you think the European Union zero deforestation is still offered to China? What's your...
That's a really tricky question. I am certainly not an expert on the Chinese government. I think what would move the Chinese government if it's concerned about the reliability of the supply chains, but also looking at the cost. So if it thinks that destabilization of the Amazon ecosystem, which I'm sure Chinese policymakers are very aware of that threat. I just don't know, how important they think it is at this point or how likely it is. But if they were to believe that was going to be a significant problem and potentially disrupt the supply chains and availability of these key commodities, then I think that would be a very strong incentive for the Chinese government to, to be supportive of policies that help protect the Amazon. I think there are opportunities to get more out of sort of the existing base of agriculture in the Amazon through regenerative agriculture and better use of cattle pasture. So stewarding the land better, so less of an extractive model and more of I guess a less extractive, just less of a extractive model. So thinking about building soils and maintaining healthy grasslands. So that's like one option where you could probably significantly increase the yield of cattle pasture without switching to like a factory farming model, which is the other approach. Obviously, factory farming has other downsides. but currently, I mean, you're looking at very low yielding cattle pasture currently in a lot of the Amazon. The other thing is doing like more, permaculture and agroforestry and mixed crops. So, I mean, just for example, there's been some really interesting projects that have done a combination of oil palm, fruit trees, and livestock together. So you're not going to get as much oil, palm oil out of a single hectare of sort of like a polyculture, but you'll get a diversified income stream. So that is another approach. So I think it's like a combination of those things, but I mean, the Chinese government is certainly not going to listen to, like people in the West telling them what to do. So I think it's going to be sort of their own self-interest that will lead to some sort of change. I mean, you did mention the EU. I think like the question is how much Chinese agriculture, or like how much of the products that China sells to Europe are actually governed or would be affected by the deforestation regulation. I just don't know the answer to that. I don't know how much food is sold, from China to the EU, which is one of the primary ones. I guess there's wood, but yeah, I'm just not sure what that looks like. But I mean, I think it is part of the equation, but it has to be more than that for it to be effective.
Great, well, thank you all so much for coming. I think we need to wrap up now. But if you have any more questions, I think Brett will be around for a few minutes, and then Brian is going to lead the group over to Crown Anchor for a Talk Before It's happy hour. So feel free to join us there if you'd like. We really appreciate you coming out. If you want to join the listserv for events like this, please go to texastropicalnetwork.org. I want to thank Bar Coffee again for providing coffee. Please grab a cup on your way out or while you're hanging out for a minute. And I want to thank the Brazil Center, the School of Journalism and Media, the Biodiversity Center, and the UT Green Fund for this. Last thing I'll say is we have stickers for the Texas Tropical Network, so come grab a sticker if you'd like one. Thank you all so much.
Should I stop the Zoom? Okay.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah.
I will be able to